Here's a class of attack that is a layer 7 denial of service attack. So it's up there at that application level. Now, normally when we talk about HTTP flood attacks, we're talking about volumetric attacks over HTTP. So imagine you had tens of thousands of machines in a botnet simultaneously making HTTP requests to a website. It's just a simple issue of scale. If there are enough requests coming in, the site is simply not going to be able to respond to them all. Those malicious requests are going to stop the legitimate traffic from getting through. So an HTTP flood attack can simply saturate the web server resources. Sometimes this is also referred to as a service request flood. But either way, it's volumetric in that it relies on just the sheer volume of requests coming into the environment. Now, it could saturate web server resources such as the allowable number of TCP connections. There are only so many a server can handle. It could also aim to saturate the bandwidth and form part of a bandwidth attack. There's only so much data a server can send back out at the same time. If you can make enough requests for large enough content and exceed that limit, legitimate users are going to have trouble getting through. HTTP flood attacks can also be amplified by the attackers targeting very specific features of the application. So for example, if an attacker forced HTTP post requests to the login page which had a slow hashing function. As a security best practice, we want hashing functions to be slow, so it's hard to crack passwords if they're disclosed. But that virtue can come at a disadvantage when it actually makes the page slow and amplifies the effect of an HTTP flood attack. Other examples include things like resources that make SMTP connections. Sending out an email is a slow process. It can take tens, even hundreds of milliseconds depending on where the web app is connecting to in order to send the mail. If an attacker can direct that volumetric layer 7 DOS attack to, say, the password reset page, which sends an email, that could bring the app to a crashing halt much faster than just returning a resource that loads quickly. Long-running requests are another good example, and have a think about the sorts of features in an application that can be slow to respond. So executing a report is a really good example. Often there's more overhead there. It may be that the database takes quite a while to process the request, so the DOS attack may actually be successful because the underlying database resources are exhausted. It's not always just the web app itself, it can be other infrastructure it's dependent on. Specifically targeting large files is another good example. So if we're looking at a bandwidth attack, and you could get a large number of machines all downloading large files which just flood the bandwidth and make it difficult for that server to respond to legitimate requests, that would be a really effective way of amplifying the attack. Now, one final point on this, and then we're going to go to a quick demo, is that these sorts of attacks against the app, can also be difficult to defend against because they may well adhere to a legitimate pattern. They're just HTTP requests. Yes, they may target specific regions of the application, but unless you specifically know what to look for, once these requests are spread out across thousands or tens of thousands of different slaves in a botnet, and they're simply making HTTP requests, they can be really difficult to identify and prevent. So that's an overview of HTTP flood attacks. I want to go and do a little demonstration that's very simple, but it's going to illustrate precisely why this style of attack is both so easy and so effective. I want to give you a really simple example of how a volumetric attack against layer 7 can be quite effective, even if it is just a DOS attack, it's not distributed. This is a website that I use really extensively across my Pluralsight courses. It's public over at hackyourselffirst.troyhunt.com. And one of the things it allows you to do is log in. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go down and enter my email address and my password, and then I'm going to log in. Okay, now that's all I've done. However, just before I logged in, I opened Fiddler so that I could capture the request. Let me jump over to Fiddler now. Here it is. We can see the request to /account/login. It's up here. And what I'm going to do now is hit Shift-R in order to repeat this request as many times as I'd like. And I'm going to repeat it 10,000 times and let it run. All those requests are now being issued. And what I'm going to do is jump over to my Azure Management Portal. And the reason I'm jumping over here now is because I've got up my monitoring where I can see the number of requests that are coming through to the site and also the number of errors. And what I'm going to do is let Fiddler send out those 10,000 requests as fast as possible. And what we're going to do is then come back, have a look at this graph, and see if we've been able to affect an HTTP flood denial of service against this target app. Let's come back shortly. So I've let this process run. I've sent 10,000 logon requests to the Hack Yourself First website. It's only gone from my machine. This is just a DOS. It's not a distributed DOS. Yet that has been enough to create quite a number of errors here. We can see the red line here representing the HTTP server errors. Now, if there were legitimate requests to the website during this time, there's a much higher chance than usual that they would actually see an error. Not only that, but if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see that the average response time peaked at over 2 minutes. So clearly this process did slow the system down significantly at that point in time. Now, whilst this wasn't a particularly dramatic attack, it was just one machine issuing requests. That was just me sending out via my consumer level bandwidth. If you had a whole range of different machines making the same requests as part of a botnet, or even if you could issue enough requests fast enough via a server with a big pipe, this graph would look very different. There'd be a lot of completely dropped requests, and of course if the attacker was serious enough, then this spike would continue much, much longer than it did. So that's a very small but hopefully impactful example. Now let's move on because I want to have a look at a few other variations of HTTP flood attacks. Let's talk about a few variations of the HTTP flood attack. And the first thing is it really doesn't matter whether it's a GET or a POST. What's more important is what impact it has on the app. So for example, what request actually places overhead on the infrastructure it's running on. Also doesn't matter whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. Once again, so long as the request actually places load on the environment and starts to saturate resources, that is the goal. Doesn't matter whether it's a secure scheme or not. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it can mimic legitimate traffic as well. So particularly botnets that are well orchestrated to make these sorts of flood requests may well pass legitimate user agent and referrer cookies, even an organic request body parameter. So for example, it may use dictionary words if it's a post request doing a search. All of this mimicking of legitimate traffic is there in order to help the denial of service attack avoid any sorts of filtering or defenses that may be happening at the target. We'll talk more about those practices in the last module of this course. And finally, another trick which is used in HTTP flood attacks is forcing content to load from the origin in order to circumvent caches or CDNs. Because what the attacker doesn't want is to have some CDN sitting in front of the underlying infrastructure, serving requests very, very quickly. They actually want it to go right through to the origin by using request patterns like this. A query string with a random parameter, something which wouldn't have already been cached. And certainly attackers that are very familiar with mounting this class of attack know how to randomize payloads enough to try and get that request all the way back through to the origin. So that's HTTP flood attacks. DOS attacks against layer 7, most commonly to web applications. Let's now move on and go down a layer, down to layer 4, and talk about SYN flood attacks.